everybody. We have a panel today on the value and limits of long-term projections and practical ways forward. That's quite a bit. Maybe a little bit on how this panel came to be. So my name is Thijs Noordzij. I work at the Dutch Ministry of Education. And in my opinion, in general, in education, we use data quite well. We know roughly what works in education, and there's a whole system of education research which gives insight in what works. But we also have to look forward, not just understand what works now, but also what do we need in the future. And that's a more complicated topic. How do you do that? Not just monitor and explain, but also predict and anticipate on what's needed for the future. We have our own forecasts. We make student forecasts in the team I work in. There's two other representatives of our team in the room. But we also thought, let's get some other expertise in so we can talk about forecasting and what does it do? How do you look into the future? What are different ways to do that with their own benefits and their own problems? So that's what brought us to this panel. We have a group of 4 people. We have Professor Daniel van Vuuren, who will start. We have Jessie, Bakens, Thom, Wittebrood, and Spit. And we have a few more people that helped in the preparation of this, 2 of which are here, and the rest is on the list. So, Daniel.
Thank you for the introduction. Well, I am going to spend some words on data and long-term forecasting scenarios and policy in just 5 minutes. So that's not an awful lot. So I will discuss a few notions, and I can imagine that there's a lot more to say and discuss, and we can do that during the discussion. Maybe going a bit fast during the presentation, but I hope you will forgive me. So the title is Thinking Ahead and Thinking Broadly, Scenario Planning for Fostering Resilience. Thinking ahead, thinking in the long run, long term, and thinking broadly, meaning that we should not just stick to one long-term projection, but think in scenarios. And that's one of the key messages I would like to give. Think in different scenarios, expect the unexpected, and also take this into account in policy planning, and try to develop robust policies, as we call them. I was a member of the State Commission Demographic Trends, which published a report earlier last year, 2024, and we made 7 demographic scenarios, very different scenarios, amongst others depending on migration flows, which differed tremendously between the different scenarios. But we try to think of policies which would make sense in all scenarios. The best policies, and this is also related to the term resilience. Okay, I already spent most of my minutes, I'm afraid. So, okay, the value and limits of demographic projections. Demography is, many think, relatively easy to predict. Well, the aging part may be so, but we can, if we look at the past, then there are examples of very poor predictions, actually. So if you look at the lines here, 1950s, 70s, then it was expected at that time that fertility would remain more or less constant or decline a little bit over time. But we all know that the pill was introduced in the 1970s and fertility dropped tremendously. That's the gray surface. And this had huge consequences for the population size in the Netherlands. So in the 1970s, it was expected that the population would be 21 million in 2000, and it turned out to be just 15.9 million. So that's a huge difference. This shows that it's dangerous to follow just one projection. Also, when making demographic projections, we should also include scenarios with very unexpected events, such as technological development called the introduction of the pill. And related to demography in particular, migration flows are can be very unexpected. And we've seen the inflow of Ukrainians recently, and before that Syrians. We've also seen periods with very low migration. Well, this should all be included in a good scenario analysis, and we try to do so with the State Commission. So uncertainty is intrinsic to demographic projections, but in general to long-term projections. But despite that, and that's the final bullet, we should make long-term projections because you would like to have some basic information as a starter for your policies. And well, with the different scenarios, you can take this uncertainty explicitly into account. I should maybe skip a few parts or go a bit fast over it. So apart from scenario analysis, it is also possible to make variant analysis, in particular policy variance. So you can assume different policies and try to either calculate or make qualitative scenarios based on those different policies in the long term. My previous employer, CPB Netherlands, CPB, Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis, does that. They make long-term projections in relation to aging and public finances, for instance. The final possibility is stochastic models, but this is quite complicated. In the pension sector, these are used for making long-term projections, also taking into account demography. But in particular, the financial sector and the stock market, etc. These are modeled stochastically and can be used to make different scenarios also. Okay, important to learn from past forecasting errors, and yeah, I think I will end with this point. The communication of uncertainty to policymakers and the broader public is very important and very difficult. Because if you look at the reporting in the newspapers, but also how figures are being discussed in politics and in parliament, they're typically discussed in a deterministic way. And the uncertainty does not get much attention. Uncertainty is very important and should be taken into account by policymakers. Policymakers should also adapt their policies if needed. This is, in practice, sometimes also difficult political stances taken by politicians. So no over-reliance on deterministic models. Okay, I think I will leave it here. Thank you for your attention.
So I'm going to tell a little bit about the type of forecasting that I do in my job at the Research Center for Education and the Labor Market from Maastricht University. We make projections for the labor market on what we call the mid-term, the medium-long run, which is 6 years ahead. And we do so for education types and occupations. So basically the results of forecasts that we have is an indicator of labor market tightness for all types of occupations and education. And we do this using a demand and supply model, but I think more current for now is that we use quantitative models for this. And we can do that because it's, let's say, only 6 years ahead, which means that you can assume away in your model certain behavioral responses, for example, right? You make a model and say, like, if we expect the structural trends to behave a certain way, the business cycle to behave a certain way, and if there is no behavioral effects, this is what we expect to happen. And obviously behavioral effects can happen, but we make projections for what happens if there's no policy, if you don't do anything. So the intention is to, if there are, for example, if there's a shortage, the idea is that you must have a behavioral effect. So in our models, which are quantitative models, we include the structural trends in the labor market based on the labor force survey. And this is really since 1996 data that we use. We use business cycle information, also from the labor force survey, but also from the CPB, the Bureau for Policy Research in the Netherlands, who make projections on the business cycle. So our model is very much dependent on other institutes in the Netherlands that make projections, and one of them is on the business cycle. The other one is on the demographic development that we use both for the development of the labor force, but also on their participation rates. And we have some indications of technological changes. But because all projections have an uncertainty, we do have a quantitative model, but we interpret the results in a qualitative way. To say, like, you have high shortages or you have high tension on the labor market, instead of pinpointing out the exact number, because that's also not how the labor market works. Uncertainty is a fact of life, so I don't think it's a big problem. I mean, well, it's not something that you should be worried about. Is the way you deal with it. And for example, in the type of models that we use, you can also basically focus on certainties that you do know, which is, for example, on technological change, demographics, and the effects both on the demand and the supply side, but also, for example, information that we have on climate change and sustainability. And for example, we are here in the social sciences, and that makes projections much more difficult, while, for example, models on climate change have proven to be quite correct in estimating what will happen. And what we also see in the labor market is that changes are, I would say, slow. Right? If we now, you have AI, and people think that it instantly disrupts everything, and that's not the case. The impact of AI is gradual. The real impact on the data, right? The real impact on the labor market is gradual. For example, you had COVID, that was really instant, and now you have, for example, the tariffs that impact the economic forecast. But it's not instant. The way that I try to look a bit at the different type of forecast that you can use is to think about the horizon that you're interested in. And in the long run, the type of models that you use and the type of information that you use is very different from the short run projections that you have. And in the long run, you want to know what the road looks like, but you don't need to know at what speed you need to travel on that road. And in the mid-run, you want to know more about the speed at which you're traveling, and in the short run, you want to know at which position on the road you need to be. So this uncertainty, obviously, the different types of uncertainty that you're dealing with is really depending on the horizon that you're looking at. And also for the long run, with a lot of uncertainty, you don't always need the very detailed models. You have a lot of experts that have a lot of knowledge on how certain things will develop.
Thank you, Jessie. I'm actually very glad that my presentation could be at this point, because I could skip a whole bunch of information because the two previous ones. My name is Thom Wittebrood. I'm an economic advisor for the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, mostly focused around the alignment of the labor market and education. I prepared this presentation together with my colleague at the Ministry of Social Affairs, Joris Canois, but he sadly couldn't be here. And this presentation is titled "The Future is Not Now," which is a bit of a standard statement you can always make, but it's quite relevant in the context of education. A bit of context, the discussion around the match between education and the labor market is becoming more and more important, or at least it's becoming more and more prevalent, because we are experiencing a labor market which can be classified as quite tight in the grand scheme of things. If you look on the graph on the left here, you can see that compared to just 10 years ago, we are seeing many more vacancies per unemployed person than we did in the past. And as you can see also, I borrowed some work from CPB that it is projected that because amongst other factors, demographic trends will have this tightness persist in the medium to long term. So people are thinking, well, if it's becoming more and more important that people reach the labor market and that we solve certain issues there, because, for example, there's a lot of vacancies for technical jobs that might be necessary to adapt the energy system, to adapt to sustainability challenges, then that work won't be done. So maybe we need to look at the education system to see if we can guide people in directions that they might be needed or where there's a lot of demand. And what we need to consider in that situation is that students will be entering the labor market not in the current situation, so the current distribution of vacancies, but in, the minimum 2 to 4 years. And if you're looking earlier in the educational careers of, for example, middle school or high school students, it can be up to 6 to 10 years of further education before your policy will actually affect the distribution of the supply on the labor market. So the work that, for example, Jessie is doing is very crucial to ensuring that when we align the education to the labor market, we are actually doing that with a future-oriented outlook. And there's a few pitfalls when we do this, because very importantly, the indicators that we use to discuss labor market trends can be quite limited in their scope. Often we discuss vacancies or the vacancy ratio, so the number of vacancies that we see per unemployed person or someone looking for work. But often institutions also use the quit rate, so the amount of people that decide to leave their job and go to another one, or to become unemployed for a while because they think, well, I have better opportunities elsewhere. Quit rate is high. There's often another measure of a labor market that is running hot. And for a long time, these were seen as the vacancy rate and the quit rate as indicators that moved in tandem. Because you think if there's a lot of vacancies, that also must mean that people are going to different jobs very often. But over time, we see, especially since the digitalization of, for example, vacancy platforms like LinkedIn, that these indicators have decoupled. And while this doesn't mean that the vacancy rate has suddenly become useless for projecting trends on the labor market, it does show that the dynamics that we see in the data that we use to observe the labor market are not static. And so that we need to consider these multiple sources to ensure that if we're looking ahead, we're actually catching the right signals of the jobs that will be in demand and which might lose demand in the future. Because if we are only following one measure, we might put all our money in a basket that might put students in a disadvantaged position, because these numbers will bias what we think is going to be full of opportunity in the future. Another one is something that I perhaps abrasively call the planner's trap. So where someone will look at a problem in the current time and see, for example, in this case, vacancies in a certain sector of the labor market, and will then relatively automatically project that these occupations will also be quite in high demand in the future. And my colleague Joris, he compared, he looked for a correlation between the indicators from the ROA, so the projections of future tightness in the labor market, to the current indicators for labor market tightness developed by our labor bureau. And we see that there's actually very little correlation between these indicators. Jessie, I think you've also done some studies around this topic. So the current vacancies do not necessarily predict where vacancies will be in the future. And we also see this when we compare that to some other indicators over time. So what does this mean? You need to be quite open-minded. Again, you don't know how the future will develop. You might miss something like the pill, where suddenly the dynamics on the labor market will change and what will be in demand shifts compared to what you are seeing in data following current trends. So when I try to advise my colleagues on what is happening on the labor market, and I would like to confer to you as well, is use multiple signals for what is happening in the demand for work and also in the supply of work. And always be careful when you extrapolate what is happening now to the future, and consider if there's maybe other sources of information that you can use to create scenarios for how technology or social dynamics or even the climate may develop and cause certain structural developments in the labor market. And finally, try to enrich the projections that you make using data with qualitative information. If you're wondering how students might choose certain degrees, go and ask them what they are interested in or what they are considering to do for work. Ask employers what they're seeing and how their tasks in their jobs are distributed, and combine that with the quantitative analysis that you do, so that you can point out things that maybe don't match up with the data that you see, or actually do follow the trends that you would expect. And there's also good examples of this. I would like to point out the labor forecast that WOBA makes, but also the European Center for Development of Vocational Education, CEDEFOP, and I'm sure a lot of other institutions that do this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So we heard a lot about making forecasts to sort of get an idea of how the future might look like. And then, of course, we want to sort of do this because we have an idea of how if the future is what we want it to be, or that we want it to look different than what the forecast might say, and that we want to implement policy to sort of intervene on this, how the future might look like, or refrain from intervening. And what I want to show is one study that we recently conducted, which we sort of run simulations in order to show how a particular intervention might pan out with relation to education. So this is about international students, and it's about language proficiency and study success, and whether language proficiency causes study success. And if we wouldn't be happy with current study success rates, whether then intervening on language proficiency would make sense. So that's one way of how you could, if you have particular forecasts you want to do something about this, how you could use data to inform policy on this. And why we did this and why it's important is, well, we know that that students have better chances of obtaining a degree if they have higher language skills. There's many studies that show this, and it's not very surprising. We use language all the time when we are in education. 2 papers, you need to read them, you need to communicate about them. And we also know that this is the case when you study in a second language, or if you're an international student and you come, for example, to the Netherlands, then your Dutch proficiency also might be very related to your study success rates here. That's whether you're in vocational education, applied university, or university. And what we also know is that it may well depend on the extent to which your study program depends on those language skills. So if you study business administration, it's predictive, but less predictive than when you study literature. We do not know if this is also the case between educational types, so whether it's as predictive in vocational education as it is in university. And so in this study, we wanted to look at this, and we used the Dutch state exam, Dutch as a second language, So this is an exam that you do if you need to study here in Dutch, but you don't have a high school degree from a Dutch institution. And we used this data set with the test scores and also a lot of other information about educational careers of international students. So what we wanted to know is we wanted to see if this exam score and this language proficiency was related to study success, and also when we would intervene on exam scores, so on language proficiency, if people would have higher language proficiency at the start of an educational program, whether they would be more likely to obtain a degree at the end of it. And so we used a big data set with a lot of information from DUO, the Dutch Office of Education. So this had information about the exam scores on different subtests. It also had information their background, so age, gender, language background, what kind of study program they did, and whether they graduated or not. And so we ran several statistical analyses. We also simulated what would happen if they would have a 50-point higher exam score, so whether if they would have more language proficiency, whether this would lead to higher study success, whether they would be more likely to obtain their degree. So you can see this as sort of possible language intervention possible policy intervention that you make sure that students start their study program with higher language proficiency if you want to increase study success rates. So this is what we did in this study, and I will go quickly through them. So here you see just general study success rates, and you see in the darker color how many across the different levels obtained a degree, and this is a similar pattern to home students. So the exam functions as a good entrance to it. And here you see the simulations. So on the left you see for universities what their study success rates were. And on the left you see what study success rates would be if people would have higher language proficiency from our statistical causal models. And in university you see that study success rates indeed increase if you would start with higher language proficiency. For applied universities it doesn't really matter. The same goes for intermediate vocational tracks. There it also doesn't really matter if you would have more language proficiency at the start of your program. And for basic vocational tracks, you would even have lesser chance of getting a degree if you have more language proficiency at the start. And so that's quite a surprising outcome. There's a lot of things to consider. I won't go into detail because we're short on time. But one thing is that it could be due to overqualification. So it might be that if you're more language proficient, that you drop out for some reason out of your vocational track because you're overqualified there. There's also, of course, many other reasons that people drop out of such a program. We cannot get insight into this with this data set. And this brings back to one of the points that was made earlier, that we need more qualitative insights into why people do not finish their study programs. If you want to know more about this, the links to the full paper is on the website, I think, somewhere. And I wanted to give this as an example of how you can use data to drive possible or inform about possible interventions that you could make if you want to influence the forecast.
Thank you all. So I think we've heard a lot of information, got insight in how forecasts work, how do we use them. Get started on the conversation with you as well. We've prepared a few questions, but I would like to give you the floor as well. So we'll start here, but feel free to join the conversation. So one of the things that when we were preparing for this panel, we're thinking about, we know that as policymakers, working at a ministry close to those policymakers, we rely on assumptions that we see happening now or have seen in the past. But it's always in a specific context, and the future projections are also based on assumptions. And know that if those assumptions are wrong, because the world is changing, the whole projection is also flawed. So in your specific case, I'm asking this to our panel, which are the assumptions of the models, the forecasting models that you currently use, that you think would be the first ones to seriously question because the future might look very differently.
Yeah, so what do you expect me to say? Demography. I think the demographic uncertainty is often overlooked, and the very long-term trends and developments are also overlooked. Let me give you an example. We know that Asia and Europe are aging quite rapidly, but we also know that the world is aging, that the world will reach its peak population around 2100, and after that the world population will decline. So this means that the migration that we're witnessing right now towards Europe, and we will still witness this migration in the coming decades, will stop at some point. We are already seeing this with respect to Eastern European migration. Eastern European migration is drying up. And in the coming years it will dry up because there are not that many young Eastern European migrants anymore. They're not there. So, well, this is an example of a development that's I think often overlooked in policy discussions. And uncertainty also, because many politicians are talking about too much migration, labor migration, asylum seekers, etc. In a few decades, the story might be completely different. At that point, it could be that we will be fighting over migrants. There might be some competition the other way.
Yeah, I think in our specific models, migration indeed is an uncertainty. But also, I think, like in the Netherlands, we are at a point where we can also. It's also, how do you say it, the population growth is also kept a bit by the accommodation of people. Right? I mean, we now see a decline in international students, and people say it's because of policies, but it can also be because they finally realize they're not able to find housing here. And I'm not sure which is what, right? So I think the number of students and migrants who will come to the Netherlands and whether they can literally be here is an uncertainty, I think. And the way that AI is impacting jobs and demand for occupations. And maybe not in a way that, how do you say this? Like, we get a lot of questions, right? So are your projections 6 years ahead still valid because we now have AI? And I think it's the other way around, that we know is going to impact, but not in this, extremely quick changes that some people tell you that it will.
Yeah, I think just what a common thread in there is that it's quite, from the perspective of someone working in policy, it's quite helpful to assume that the way certain dynamics play out will continue to do so in the future, because that is something that you can then base your policy decisions on, and makes it, uncertainty. It's a fact of life, but it's not a fact of life that in policy is very welcome, because if you embrace this uncertainty, it means you'll have to do more explaining, and the risk of you being wrong also needs to be part of the conversation. And that's something that policymakers and also politicians, understandably, do not really want to have part of the conversation. You want to communicate confidence. You want to communicate competence, and often this to communicate. You already mentioned that to communicate that uncertainty is difficult, and then it's also very attractive to assume that, for example, the way that students migrate to the Netherlands will stay the same over time, or the way that the labor demand will develop will stay the same over time, because then that means you can base your policy off of that. And then when it changes, it's then even hard to measure effectively. So then you're in this environment where you have less information than you did before. So it's all in all not very attractive to assume that that the dynamics that are playing out will change. I think that's I think then the assumption that, in my opinion, should be challenged, and that's what I try to do in my work, is will things keep working the way that they have before? I think COVID also has been sort of a moment where a lot of people have started asking these questions. For example, central banks also started thinking about, well, why is inflation moving in way different ways than we saw previously? Maybe it wasn't just necessarily COVID, but at least the moment made them question if things work that way that we expect them to.
So I'm not a demographic expert, so I don't know which assumptions are maybe not correct, but what we learned from our study is that it helps a lot to make those assumptions explicit. And I think that is not really happening very often. We use these directed acyclic graphs that you saw in the presentation, which can be used to inform about the causal relationships in the system that you're investigating. And I think that's really useful to see what are actually our assumptions underlying the phenomenon that we're studying. And then we can sort of have a more structured discussion about which assumptions also might or might not be correct. And I think that that's one practical way forward that we were also talking about in this.
So is that helpful because you're getting reactions back from the people that read your work? Or is it also because it forces I can imagine it's also helpful because it forces you to be, as the author, to be conscious about the assumptions that you're working with, forcing you to express them and question them already. Both, yeah, that's an easy answer. I think that's. But so a bit of info about Vuuren is that he works in both policy and research. But is that something that we could do in policy also more often than expressing? I'm starting to ask my own questions, Thijs, if that's okay. But how would we go about that? Expressing assumptions in policy advice and papers.
And he also wanted to say something on this, but I think it just helps getting this discussion between all parties, because often the assumptions that scientists and policymakers make do not really align very well. But it's often difficult to pinpoint where this misalignment is, and having some sort of instrument to talk about this alignment could be beneficial.
I fully agree that it's very important to be explicit about the assumptions you make in any projection. And it is typically what you do in a scenario analysis, of course. In a scenario analysis, you first think about plausible assumptions and then develop the scenarios quantitatively. And the scenarios are, you can see it as a way to challenge assumptions. In particular, as a state commission, we had different demographic scenarios developed by CBS, the Statistics Netherlands Bureau. And then they came up with 5 scenarios, and we said, no, this is not sufficient. We need more extreme scenarios with unforeseen events such as the pill. And then they made 6 and 7 scenario with extreme migration assumptions, for instance. And I think this was very useful for us. And this can be seen as a challenge to the more common assumptions on migration.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a very really delving into the topic of this panel. I would also like to give the room the opportunity to chime in.
So thanks a lot. What I'm getting from your discussion is that you tend not to really want to change your projections very much. You kind of, you make your projections and you have your assumptions and you think it's going to continue as projected, mainly within the assumptions that you've made. But at some point, you need to acknowledge that your assumptions were wrong, right? At some point, you can no longer deny the fact, all right, well, we didn't expect that we're going to spend 5% of our BBP on defense-related costs. And that will, of course, also affect the labor market if there's such a huge difference in where the money is being spent. So how do you and on the other hand, you also want to have a stable policy, that you don't adjust your policy with the whims of a political party or whatever. So how do you make this balance between still adjusting your projections according to when you know you're wrong, but still also maintain some form of stability within your policy?
So I need a moment there. It's a difficult question, and a very good one at that. So I think it's a good question to ask, also knowing what we've been talking about, where it's attractive to avoid the uncertainty. I think one of the things is making scenarios. So, depending on the minister you work for, you might present a certain scenario as the one that is desirable. But if you do your work right, you've prepared other scenarios that might be desirable in different situations or different preferences. And then you can be prepared for these things to shift. So in an ideal world, for example, we would have prepared a scenario for what would the labor market look like if suddenly we have a spike in demand for military industry, for example. And another one, I think, is to be willing to change things despite it being kind of scary. And I think they're being explicit and also being outspoken towards the people making decisions, that it's important to communicate the grounds on which you base your decisions, that's not a source of weakness, but also a good thing to point towards when you change your mind about things. Because if you say, we are making this decision now, for example, to ensure that students have a good entry into the labor market, we believe that this option will do that. You can go back later and say, oh, in 3 years, we see now that AI is shifting the way that the tasks are demanded in the world of work. So we will now change what we're doing. And then suddenly you use that uncertainty as a reason to change what you're doing. And you're actually, I'd like to think that then you are expressing that competence that people are looking for when they are listening to their policymakers.
I think like the moment that you know more, you can put it in your models, right? And I think also horizon-wise, maybe 10 years ago, if you would have talked to people that know about international politics, they would have told you, like, be aware that, I don't know, Russia is unstable. So, our scenery is going to change. And that's the scenario. But now, for example, for the expenses in defense, I think like for the type of models that we make, we can do scenarios of what will happen. But you also need to make much, let's say, more assumptions. For example, how these investments will be financed, which has a huge impact on spending and on the labor market. So that's why you need scenarios. You can, right? You can, in the type of models that we do, you can make the one, like new projections if policymakers have decided how to do it, and you can make I think scenarios if you want to help them knowing, okay, if you do it like this, then this is the impact. Or
to add one remark, I think it's actually a very good question, and if you look at the frequency with which you would want to change policies, then for sure I would say not twice a year. It's obvious, so obviously once a year at most, but for many policies I would even say maybe once every 4 years or once every 10 years. Because, well, look at the defense industry. Stability is a very important aspect.